Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Child Anxiety Fact Podcast. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I'm the owner of Child Anxiety Support, a membership for parents of anxious kids. I have my master's in clinical counseling and additional postgraduate training in child anxiety disorders, including exposure and response prevention and the Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions program, or SPACE program, which was designed by Dr. Ellie Lebowitz of the Yale Child Study Center. I'm also certified in infant-toddler mental health. FACT stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and each week I'll be answering your questions about childhood and teen anxiety. Let's get started. Hey folks, this week's question is, what can teachers do to help students with anxiety? Teachers can do a lot. Namely, they can recommend that their anxious students get on a 504 plan. This requires collaboration between the teachers and the administrators and the parents, which is a great way to get eyes on the child and everyone on board to helping that child be successful. So let's talk a little bit about 504s. If a child has anxiety or OCD, then they may qualify for a 504 plan. 504 refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That's the civil rights legislation that protects individuals with a disability from discrimination in any program that receives federal funds from the Department of Education. What this means is that students with anxiety severe enough to, quote, limit one or more major life activities, end quote, qualify for support. A 504 may require a formal diagnosis. That would be from a doctor or a counselor, clinical social worker, or psychologist. But some schools will offer supports on the recommendation of a school counselor alone. The anxiety must cause, quote, substantial limitation, end quote, and the specifics on what this means and how it will play out will depend on the school, but generally it refers to how well the child is functioning in comparison to their peers. And who better to know that than the teacher who is seeing the whole classroom? If a child's anxiety is getting in the way of their functioning, if they are melting down, missing class, or having trouble finishing their work due to their anxiety, then they would qualify. Now, note that federal funding part, it may mean that a child would not get a 504 if they go to a private school that doesn't receive federal funding. But that doesn't mean that teachers there can't use a 504 model to support their students. Oh, and charter schools do use 504s, just so you know. Back to the question. Teachers can refer a child to a 504 plan, as can counselors and other support staff, and parents can request that too. A 504 plan is similar but different than an IEP or individualized education program. An IEP addresses 13 specific diagnoses, which include ADHD or autism. I mention these because anxiety is often a feature of those diagnoses, and if your child has ADHD or autism, you may want to pursue an IEP since that will be more encompassing. IEPs provide special education, while a 504 plan is more broad and provides support to remove educational barriers. A 504 plan also tends to be, but isn't always, less formal. Schools receive additional funding for children on an IEP, but they do not for a 504. An example of the difference of an IEP and a 504 is a child on an IEP might receive help from an aide or get pull-out services, while a child with a 504 would not. They would get supports and accommodations that allow them to remain and be served in the classroom. Rarely, a child with OCD or anxiety as a standalone diagnosis might meet criteria for an IEP, but again, if they can stick with their peers with some accommodation or support and they don't need special services outside of the classroom, then a 504 is the way to go. That's what they'll qualify for. I know it's confusing, but most of the time, a child with anxiety will be on a 504, not an IEP. Now, there are not standard accommodations for anxiety because its presentation is different in different kids, but there are common accommodations, and those might include getting a heads up about a pop quiz so they're not surprised by testing, or a reduction in homework or more time to finish it. They might be given the ability to leave the classroom to see the school counselor, get a drink of water, or just take a break. They might be allowed to have fidgets or comfort items at their desk, or the classroom seating may be adjusted in some way to help the child feel safe, such as near a door or near the teacher or near a friend. Or maybe the child might be allowed to listen to music or wear headphones to block out noise. I wanted to stop here for just a minute to talk about that word accommodations. So we've been talking about accommodations to help the child be successful in school, and that's the words we use, accommodation. However, in the clinical anxiety and OCD literature, when we're talking about accommodations, we're talking about the things that keep kids stuck in anxiety. So, just to be clear, when we're talking about 504s, we're using the word accommodation to address policies that remove barriers to the child's success in the academic setting. And when we're talking about the clinical research and we're talking about accommodations, we're talking about those things that keep a child stuck. Same word, two different meanings. Now, this is what's tricky. Sometimes academic accommodations in a 504 plan are supportive and helpful, and sometimes they are indeed accommodations in the clinical sense, which is to say they keep kids stuck. For example, one support often listed in 504 plans is allowing the child to record a presentation instead of standing in front of the class to read it. So maybe they're allowed to go home and have their parent film it on their iPhone and turn it in that way, or the child's allowed to do it just to the teacher, not to the class. We could argue that that kind of accommodation does indeed keep the child stuck in their anxiety about public speaking. Because remember, when we're talking about clinical accommodations, we're talking about avoidance. And yes, that kind of accommodation where the child does not have to speak in front of the class the way the other students do, whether that's because they're having their presentation recorded or they're getting to present just to the teacher, yes, that is avoidance, sure. But if we're working on social anxiety as a whole, there is likely better places to put our efforts. And meanwhile, that child needs to not be falling behind in school. So as a support, helping the child not present in front of the class, I'd say, that's okay if we have plans to work on social anxiety in other ways. And that can be part of the 504 too, like helping a child connect with peers in other ways. Maybe they attend a lunch bunch group with the school counselor, or maybe the teacher is creating connections by assigning work groups or dyads. In other words, sometimes the accommodations are about avoidance, but maybe that accommodation makes sense if we are working on eliminating accommodations in other ways that support the exposure. Is that making sense? If it's not, let me know and we can talk about it more. Ideally, the plans that we put in place in school will do both things. It will give the child a chance to be exposed to and overcome their anxiety, but also will give them the supports they need to be successful. If we're working with a child who has a separation anxiety and they often go to the nurse's office and say, my stomach hurts, I need you to call my mom, I need to go home, that might be a great place for the school and parents to work together to interrupt that behavior, right? The parents may say, we are not picking our child up from school anymore when they're not actually ill because we know that their stomach is hurting because they have separation anxiety and they want to come home and we need them to stay in school. And so the 504 may write that in, that instead of sending the child home, the school will find other ways to give them that break from the classroom with an expectation that they will return. Maybe the child gets a pass to spend, say, 15 or 20 minutes practicing some breathing exercises with the nurse or the school counselor, but ultimately is heading back to class. That would be an accommodation that is supporting exposure. You can see how accommodations, clinical accommodations, the things that keep a kid stuck, may become part of a 504 plan, but if there is broader work on helping the child expose themselves to some measure of anxiety, then again, this can work well. Again, 504s are individualized, and parents and teachers can be thinking about which supports make long-term sense, like being able to take an exam in the library where it's quiet, and which should be short-term with a plan to move the child away from that and toward greater independence, like having the child sit near the teacher for now while the school actively works on helping them connect to other kids in other ways. I'll tell you one thing. When I look over 504s, I am impressed by the creativity and compassion I see in so many of them. And I have found that many teachers, when they work with a family to create a 504 plan for one student, end up discovering that the whole class benefits. 504s give us a chance to look at some policies and procedures critically. For example, lots of kids do better when they can check out a fidget to take to their seats, and lots of kids do better when they can listen to music during study time on their headphones. If you are interested in talking to your child's school about creating a 504 plan, I encourage you to reach out to your child's teacher and perhaps the school counselor to get it started. They'll help you figure out next steps. And even if your child doesn't qualify for a 504, you can still talk and should talk to those providers about better ways to meet your child's needs. Okay, thanks. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. If you have a question you would like me to answer on the show, please go to childanxietysupport.com/FAQ. And if you'd like to learn more about the Child Anxiety Support membership, please go to childanxietysupport.com. The membership offers courses, live events, and community to help you design a personalized program to free your family from the trap of child anxiety. I hope you'll consider subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with any friends or family who you think might find it helpful. You can get more of my child anxiety content over at Instagram, where I'm Dawn Friedman, MSED, or on Facebook at the Child Anxiety Support page. Thanks again, and have a great week.